So my last video was a complex breakdown of the intricate mechanics of Dragon Ball FighterZ, and it didn't get many views at all. Hey, I get it. Not a ton of my viewers play this game, even though they absolutely should, but whatever. Maybe that was just way too complicated and cerebral for you guys. So, for all you viewers, I'll take a look at some games that are more around your intelligence level. Hopefully this will keep you entertained. XD. That's right, we're taking a look at some games by Humongous Entertainment, 3 to be exact. Humongous Entertainment, for those of you who are not aware, made a bunch of point-click adventure games for kids in the 90s. When I say for kids, I should make clear that I'm not referring to kid-friendly games that can be played at all ages, like Crash or Sonic. These games were geared specifically toward children. Now, this might be hard to believe, but I was actually a child at one point, and I actually owned and played 3 Humongous Entertainment games. It's possible that I had played more, but the 3 I distinctly remember are Putt-Putt Joins the Parade, Let's Explore the Jungle with Buzzy, and Freddi Fish 3, The Case of the Stolen Conch Shell. And, because I don't have anything better to do during the pandemic, I thought it would be fun to take a look at these 3 games. 1, I think will be a nice little trip down memory lane, but more importantly 2, it'll be interesting to see how these games differentiate from the games I typically play and cover on this channel. Now there's a concept I need to break down before we begin, as this will serve as the bedrock of my analysis. That concept is of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I'd like to just lie and say I learned about it in one of the many books I, the intellectual, have read, but actually I learned about them from this Minecraft video because of course I did. A serious critique of Minecraft by YouTube user Whitelight. It's a very good video, obviously, as this video likely wouldn't exist without it. Anyways, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. The prefixes in and x actually give away the definitions a bit. Intrinsically motivated players are able to create their own fun. They favor games that are more open-ended and sandboxy, so Minecraft is an obvious favorite. Extrinsically motivated players, on the other hand, like a clearly defined set of goals, something to work towards. Basically any game with a story mode favors the extrinsically motivated. Of course, this is a pretty big oversimplification. The intrinsically and extrinsically motivated can appreciate the same game for different reasons. Grand Theft Auto is an excellent example. The extrinsically motivated can tackle the story missions and be rewarded with cutscenes that continue said story, while the intrinsically motivated can have just as much fun killing people or whatever it is you do in GTA 5, I don't know. I should also interrupt myself to say that these 2 groups don't necessarily exist on opposite planes of reality. It's more like a spectrum. I suppose we should tie down more technical definitions for these terms, or as technical as I'm willing to get in a video about baby games. If we perform a task for a reward, like going to work to make money, we're exhibiting extrinsic motivation. If we perform a task purely for fun, we're exhibiting intrinsic motivation. If we're intrinsically motivated, the performance of the task itself is the reward in some sense. This is where things get interesting, as, really, any game requires a degree of intrinsic motivation. Unless you play games competitively and attend tournaments to win sums of cash, you're not monetarily compensated for playing games. The fun derived from playing the game is the reward. And even for those competitive players, you'll usually find that the fun they had playing these games was their gateway drug. Last thing I'd like to say about these forms of motivation is pure conjecture on my part. I have no idea if this is actually the case, but I'd guess that kids are relatively more intrinsically motivated than adults. Or perhaps it would be more proper to say that people become more extrinsically motivated as they grow older. I'm going to speak from experience here, as it's why I believe this. I grew up playing Crash Bandicoot Warped. However, when I played the game, it was actually on my dad's save file. My dad had beaten the game, and I would go around on his file and just play the same couple of levels over and over and over again. The reason I played the game this way was because I was afraid of the dinosaur that chases you in level 4. I got squished one time and decided I wasn't ever doing that again. So instead, I played on my dad's file and played the same couple of levels over and over again. Mainly the platforming levels from the first 3 warp rooms, but I also had a soft spot for level 3. I vividly remember playing the game like this when I was little. They're some of my earliest memories. Somehow I didn't get bored of doing the same thing over and over. Now, as an adult that exists during the pandemic, I've got plenty of time to play these same few levels over and over. Also, I'm not afraid of cartoon dinosaurs anymore and can add those levels to the pool of stuff I'll play 1,000 times in a row. So, why am I writing this video instead? When I play this game now, well, for starters, I hardly play it as often as I used to, and when I do, it's from a fresh new game. I go out of my way to get all the items, and once I've gotten everything, I don't touch the game. Often when I replay the game, I find different ways to play it, like trying to beat each level as fast as possible, or while spinning as few times as possible. So, what gives? My guess is that, as a kid, I was more intrinsically motivated. The act of moving Crash about the screen was rewarding enough. As an adult, I'm more extrinsically motivated. I'm still playing a video game, and am therefore still exhibiting some intrinsic motivation, so I'm not about to demand some real-world compensation. But I do want some acknowledgement of my work. Nothing major, just a little in-game item that I get to show off, something that takes skill to achieve, and something that not everybody can get. In all three of the games we'll be covering, there's a large emphasis on intrinsic motivation. There's lots of repetition and a lot of content that doesn't progress the story. In fact, there's sometimes not even a story at all. These games are certainly far less engaging to adults than they are to kids. Or perhaps I mean to say that kids require less constant stimulation and engagement on behalf of the game to remain stimulated and engaged. I don't know. Does that make sense? Probably not. I feel like I've gone on long enough. I suppose we should actually just get into the games now, but first... let's get just a little in-depth on the company behind these games, Humongous Entertainment. Humongous Entertainment was founded by Ron Gilbert, who left his post at LucasArts to start the company. He is most well known for his work on Maniac Mansion and Monkey Island, both point-and-click adventure games. He developed a tool called the Script Creation Utility for Maniac Mansion, or as the acronym would have it, SCUM! SCUM! Scum would later be used on many LucasArts games, and Gilbert would take Scum with him to Humongous Entertainment. The inspiration for Humongous Entertainment came from Gilbert watching a 5-year-old play Monkey Island. This 5-year-old couldn't read, and for those of you who are not aware, Monkey Island is a text-based game. So this child had absolutely no idea what was going on, but through trial and error managed to find out how to move about the world. The child became totally lost in the world, but was having a blast doing it. This fascinated Gilbert, and inspired him to make point-and-click adventure games for kids. Also, so that these kids weren't completely lost, he wanted these games to be fully voiced. That leads us to Humongous Entertainment's first game, which is coincidentally also the first game we'll be covering. Here's a fun fact. This was the first game I ever played. Probably. Longtime viewers may remember a video I made way back about 6 years ago now, where I mentioned that the first game I ever played was Freddi Fish 3. Well, that wasn't exactly a lie, as for the longest time I really did believe that was my first game. However, my mom, who would likely have an easier time recalling this than I would, said some things to me that led me to believe that my first game was probably this one. Not super relevant to the analysis, but that's just something I thought I should mention. So, Putt-Putt Joins the Parade was developed in 1992 for MS-DOS and was later ported to Windows and Macintosh in 1995, 2 years before I was even born. It's a point-and-click adventure game in the most absolute basic sense of the term. The player is only ever asked to use the mouse to click objects on the screen. Interacting with objects, talking to other characters, and moving Putt-Putt around the screen are all done via a mouse click. The keyboard gets completely neglected in, spoiler alert, all of the games we'll be covering today. The player is typically only ever required to click one thing at a time. In some instances, the player will be asked to click on an item in their inventory and then click on something else as though they were placing the item on top of the cursor's position. The most complex this gets is having to time a mouse click, and the only instance of this timing challenge I could find is this completely optional interaction in the very beginning of the game. If the player clicks the frog with proper timing, he'll catch a fly. The player could also just as easily rapidly click like a madman and eventually catch the fly, as there's no losing condition. You aren't punished for incorrectly timing a click here. Putt-Putt's goal is to join the Car Town Parade. To do this, he needs a balloon and a pet. He also needs to get either a paint job or a car wash. Getting the balloon is incredibly easy since it's always in the same place every time. To get a paint job or car wash, Putt-Putt will have to earn money by either mowing lawns or delivering groceries. Putt-Putt will find a bone while mowing lawns, which he needs to use to attract the puppy, his pet. This is all incredibly simple and can literally be done in under 10 minutes. Even a child would find this boring. But this isn't all there is to Putt-Putt Joins the Parade. In fact, only a very small percentage of all the content in this game actually progresses the story. The entire opening of this game serves as a very good litmus test. For example, look at this screen. The only way to progress is to click up here. You could just progress the game like you're supposed to, or you can click on these apples. Clicking them causes all these weird cartoony things to happen. They make funny sounds as they bounce around the screen. To most of us, this is cute, but completely pointless. However, to the intrinsically motivated and naturally curious, this is meaningful gameplay. A cartoon just played before their eyes and they caused it to happen. It might be hard to remember seeing as how incredibly primitive these sprites look, but this is a huge deal for a kid, especially a kid in the late 90s. This is an important angle to consider when analyzing this game. In fact, to not consider it would be kind of missing the point completely, in my opinion. This entire opening segment is truly genius in my opinion. Starting in Putt-Putt's home, there's plenty of things to interact with. This immediately establishes that the game can be handled at your own pace. Putt-Putt can just dart out of the house, or can stop to eat a bowl of tire O's and brush his teeth. Interestingly, there's a coin lying on the table, which will save more diligent players some work later on, and also teaches the player about the inventory system. There's also the frog timing challenge I mentioned earlier. On the next few screens, the player is taught the basic movement controls. Click a spot on the screen and Putt-Putt will move there. You can interact with the environment and play all of these little mini cartoons. Flowers dance, there's the bouncing apples I mentioned previously, there's getting fish to jump out of a pond, and there's even a caterpillar that quickly turns into a butterfly when clicked on. The fact that all this content is optional is what makes it so special. It is the player that single-handedly caused all these things to happen. Without player input, the flowers and apples would remain idle. There's big talk in the realm of game analysis of teaching without tutorials. basically designing the game in such a way that a player doesn't need to be rudely interrupted and told things that they either already know or could figure out on their own. Instead, they're taught through less intrusive means, such as level design that gives the player room to experiment and subtly guides them in the right direction.
Figure it out.
Everyone brings up World 1-1 of Super Mario Bros., Mega Man X's Highway Stage, or Rupture Farms in Abe's Odyssey, as they should, but nobody seems to bring up the opening of Putt-Putt Joins the Parade. I'll be perfectly honest, I feel like it deserves to be mentioned more often. Okay, Putt-Putt's opening obviously isn't quite as genius as those other examples, but this game isn't nearly as complex as those, and it isn't trying to be. It does exactly what it needs to do. Before entering Car Town, the player needs to honk their horn to make a cow move out of the way. This is a test to make sure the player understands how to interact with their inventory before they're let loose on the rest of the game's world. Immediately upon entering Car Town, the game breaks its rule of giving players control over the cartoon by forcibly making Putt-Putt enter a cutscene. I would criticize this, but I actually find this necessary as this cutscene tells the player the requirements for joining the parade. This way, players don't wander around with zero direction. I also find this important because of this line right here.
Hey, Smokey, do you know where I should go to mow lawns today?
Try Green Street first.
The color of the street mentioned is actually randomized between playthroughs, so on one playthrough you'll be asked to mow lawns on Green Street, while on another you'll be asked to mow lawns on Blue Street. Each road is blocked by a puzzle, with some requiring key items found elsewhere to progress. All this, in my opinion, adds to the replayability of these games. These games were definitely designed to be played multiple times over. For starters, the end of the game blatantly asks you if you want to play again. Not the most elegant way of getting that point across, but the point has been delivered nonetheless. More interesting to me, however, is how the route to complete the game changes slightly depending on what road you're told to go down. If the player goes down Green Street, they can very quickly mow lawns and earn the money they need. If the player is sent down Red Street, however, they'll need to go to the toy store to get a key item needed for a puzzle. The toy store was completely optional on the first playthrough, but is now required on this one. Even still, the player can immediately leave the store if they wanted to. The more intrinsically motivated may take the time to engage in all of the optional interactions. Personally, I remember being a really big fan of this marble minigame when I was little. Of course, now I actually had to go out of my way to waste more time here since I wasn't happy with the 30 seconds of footage I initially recorded. As an adult, these games just aren't sustaining enough, to say the least. But I can appreciate how these optional interactions just give the game so much character. Some of my earliest memories come from these little moments. In particular, I remember getting a huge laugh out of this tire pump. And being fascinated by this robot.
The time is 2:21 o'clock.
One thing I also really admire is the completely optional paint job you can get. For 3 coins instead of the 2 required for the car wash, you can paint Putt-Putt a different color. After you've picked that color, he'll remain that color until the end of the game. This likely isn't the least bit impressive to most of us, especially nowadays, as this sort of color palette swap can easily be done in Microsoft Paint, but to a less technically literate kid in the 90s, this is awesome. I guess if there's something I can criticize, it's this. I found that these optional interactions become less abundant as the game goes on. In the beginning of the game, you can click basically any corner of the screen and make something cool happen. The same can be said for a few locations in Car Town, such as Mr. Baldini's store, the toy store, or all of the little residential areas. Same can't be said for some other locations, however. The car wash barely had anything to interact with, and the colored roads were completely barren after their puzzles had been cleared. I was going to save this for the end, but I feel like I have to bring it up now. This is the official box art for the Macintosh and Windows ports of the game. On here, it says that the game is recommended to players ages 3 to 8. It also says this on the horrifying box art for the 3DO port. In my opinion, this is an excellent first video game, and I would definitely say kids in the 3 to 5 age bracket will enjoy it, as I did. However, I can also easily imagine an 8-year-old reaching that point of saturation where they've seen every optional interaction and the game stops being interesting to them. Perhaps that's more the case now than it was in the 90s, as games have become more mechanically advanced and players have gotten younger. Also, I am not 3, or 5, or 8, so I can't say any of this for certain. Anyway, that's gonna be my final word on Putt-Putt for now. It's a delightful little game, and a great start for Humongous Entertainment, but there's definitely some room for improvement. And improve they would, as they would release many games after this. They would release a sequel to Putt-Putt, a new game called Fatty Bear, and a new game called Freddi Fish that would serve as a huge stepping stone for the company. Specifically because of one huge technical innovation, the way the art was made. Previously, the art was all made in the computer, each pixel was meticulously placed in a precise manner, leading to some limited animation that had some charm to it, but would soon be outdone. According to Ron Gilbert, about halfway through the production of the first Freddi Fish game, he went to a conference and heard a talk from someone from another game company. He couldn't remember the game or the company, but this was a company that also made games for kids. He could clearly remember what he saw and the dread that overcame him. The art for this unknown game was actually drawn on paper and then
scanned in like traditional film animation.
To quote him directly, the dread came about not from the sexy pixels as he called them, but how the foundation underneath him suddenly gave way. The current model he was working with would soon be obsolete. So, he needed to adapt or die. He would adapt, obviously. This meant throwing out all of the artwork made for the game and starting over from scratch. The engine also had to be reworked to handle the art. Their efforts paid off for them, as Freddi Fish ended up being a huge success. All Humongous Entertainment games from this point onward would include much more detailed character sprites, animations, and backgrounds. In my opinion, the next game on our schedule shows the fruits of that labor. Let's Explore the Jungle with Buzzy was released for Macintosh and Windows in November of 1995, still before I was born. It is the third and last entry in the Junior Field Trip series. These games were made in conjunction with Random House, an American book publisher. My guess is that in a time before Google, they provided all the information in the game's index. This game, and the entire Junior Field Trip series, differ from most other Humongous Entertainment games in a few major ways. These games kinda act like virtual tours. Unlike Putt-Putt or Freddi Fish, there is no story or tangible progression. Soon as the game starts, the player hears a quick word from Buzzy the Knowledge Bug, who's more or less the virtual tour guide, and then the player is let loose on the game's world. There's absolutely no goal, no endgame, and no win or lose condition. More than any other game in this video, really more than any other game I can think of, this game favors the intrinsically motivated. In Putt-Putt, optional interactions were a cherry on top. Obviously it was a pretty big cherry, as that game wouldn't be nearly as memorable without them, but I've already said my word on that. Point is, in Let's Explore the Jungle, that little side dish is now the whole meal. This game doesn't completely neglect the extrinsically motivated and isn't totally aimless. We'll get into that as we move on. But this game was undoubtedly the hardest to record and write for. I knew what I wanted to talk about with Freddi Fish before I started working on this video, and much of my analysis for Putt-Putt just came naturally to me. But when playing this game, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was nothing to do, even though there was plenty for me to do. I can't free myself from the shackles of my extrinsically motivated bias. Going back to that dichotomy of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, I think there's an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants that explores this concept quite well. Oh my god, what's wrong with me? This SpongeBob episode would be The Paper. SpongeBob will often have episodes that focus on the pairing of SpongeBob and Squidward, and their clash of perspectives is where most of the comedy is mined from. SpongeBob has a childlike sense of wonderment about him, while Squidward fully embodies the cynicism of adulthood. In this episode, SpongeBob, who is more childlike and intrinsically motivated, has an absolute blast with a useless piece of paper and his imagination. Squidward, who is more grown up and extrinsically motivated, is envious of the fun SpongeBob is having and decides to give away everything, including the shirt on his back, for the useless piece of paper, only to discover that it is, in fact, a useless piece of paper. The same limitless world of possibilities that were available to SpongeBob are available to Squidward in this moment, but his extrinsically motivated mind can't tap into them, and therefore he can't derive any enjoyment from the paper. As he holds the piece of paper, he likely thinks to himself, what am I supposed to do with it? Playing this game, I felt an awful lot like Squidward. Even writing this video has me scratching my head. The opening sequence of Putt-Putt served as the perfect opportunity to talk about the mechanics of this game, with no equivalent moment in Let's Explore. Thankfully, Buzzy the Knowledge Bug is here to help. When the game starts, you get an expansive view of the entire game world, and Buzzy gives you some direction. He mentions some specific
points of interest
in each of the main areas. At any point, the player can click on Buzzy's face and be given a fun fact.
Those cave tetras are blind. If you live in a dark cave, I suppose you don't need eyes.
For me, this functioned more like a hint for what I should show off in my footage next. There's also the What is this button. Click it and then click anything on the screen and it will take you to the index entry for that thing. One feature I like is that, while in the index, you can be reading about an animal and then click their picture and fast travel to their location. As far as the gameplay goes, that's really about it. Click on things if you want to. Read about things, if you want to. As an adult, I feel like I can't truly properly appreciate this game. Sadly, I fall well out of the intended audience age bracket. However, as an adult, I've also found plenty of things I can admire about this game that I don't think I could have when I was a kid. Or could have, but couldn't have put into words. I'll cut to the chase. The entire presentation side of this game is absolutely phenomenal. Within the last few years, we've seen a great deal of passion for the retro game aesthetic. Pixel graphics have made a comeback, and people have become quite fond of the highly compressed, cartoony sound effects of Half-Life, with many people preferring them to the cleaner, more realistic sounds of later games. People have made tons of memes just dedicated to the sound effects from Half-Life.
Drake? What? Where's... Goes right there. See, I drew it with...
H-E-V.
I mention this because the sound design in this game is something I feel like modern audiences could really appreciate. First of all, something I admire is the lack of music. It allows you to more easily absorb the atmosphere of this game. I think when it comes to making children's media, there's this temptation. There's this idea that if you aren't fumbling over yourself to maintain children's attention 100% of the time with a constant stream of sound, they'll get bored and change the channel. At the very least, I feel like this was a common idea at the time. So, I feel like it was a fairly courageous move for Humongous Entertainment to not include music. They're willing to let the game's superb sound design speak for itself. I absolutely love these sound effects in all of their archaic, compressed, crunchy glory. I'll share an example of a subtle detail I really admire. You may need headphones to properly hear this. At the highest level of the jungle, you can faintly hear this waterfall. As you get closer to the waterfall, it becomes louder. It's a minor detail, but that's why I appreciate it so much. It's just a little detail to make the world feel alive, but it isn't begging for your attention. There are so many amazing soundscapes in this game. I'll play a few more now. I really admire how chill this game can be. And now, at the risk of contradicting what I literally just said, what I love more than anything else about this game is just how unapologetically silly it is. Clicking on things always yields an inappropriately silly result. I kinda love how at odds these little interactions can be with the otherwise very peaceful atmosphere of the game. Perhaps I should just show you. Since Putt-Putt, the amount of these optional interactions has gone up considerably. In fact, you could honestly click just about any corner of the screen and get something to happen. There's enough content here that it would take a long time for a kid, or really anybody, to view every optional interaction. Even though there's really no gameplay to speak of, an incredible amount of effort went into making this world feel alive and interactive. For as much as I love this game though, I find that I have a lot more fun talking about it than I do playing it. And this is no fault of the game's. I'll repeat myself and say that this game greatly prefers the intrinsically motivated. This isn't inherently bad, it's just different to what I'm used to. And an unfortunate side effect of this approach is that extrinsically motivated players like myself, or pretty much any other adult, will get bored fairly quickly. So thankfully we have some minigames that we can sink our teeth into, that I've neglected to mention until now. Trivia contains the kind of multiple choice questions most kids play games to avoid, and I find the word jumble to be almost patronizing, which is a shame since Humongous Entertainment doesn't typically underestimate the intelligence of their audience. So I don't really have much to say about these. Instead, I'll pick on some of the more interesting minigames, of which there are 3. First up is Find It, which in my opinion is pretty clever. The game gives you a picture of a thing and tasks you to find said thing on the map. On the easiest difficulty, the game will redirect you to the screen the item is on, and simply asks you to find its position on the screen. On the medium and hard difficulties, the game will just dump you into any old place on the map and have you make your way to where the thing is, and then task you with clicking on it. On the hardest difficulty, the game will sometimes require you interact with an object to make the key item visible. My only gripe is that the game stops to exuberantly celebrate every single found item like it's a cure for cancer, or, at the risk of dating this video, the coronavirus. Anyway, I know the kids this game is directed towards have more of a stomach for repetition than me, the out-of-place adult in the room, but I feel like even they would get sick of this. It's a little too much of a pace breaker. This screen is how the game gives you your objective. There's this slow animation of the game randomly deciding what the next item you'll be tasked with finding is, although you can bypass this if you want. I like this minigame, but if I could go back and make some changes for the latter 2 difficulties, I would have revealed all of the items at once. Then, let the player cycle between the ones they haven't found yet while on the map. And, in the beginning of the game, I would have had Buzzy suggest that the players start here. I think this would have given the more extrinsically motivated players a reason to explore and click around, while the intrinsically motivated could just ignore it. Still, I can't really complain too much. Besides, I think the statute of limitations on offering these developers advice has long passed. Anyways, next minigame. Coloring book. It's a coloring book, not an album. There isn't much for me to say about this one, honestly. I guess one thing I do admire is that Rather than just give you a list of colors to choose from, it gives you the 3 primary colors and tasks you with creating all the colors in between, so mix blue and yellow to get green. Pretty simple, but I think it forces kids to use their brains just a little bit, and I think that's a good thing. Also, it frees up space on the screen and gives the player access to more colors, assuming they know how to mix them. I don't know, I think I'm delving a little too deep into this one. Alright, I've saved the best minigame for last. Anteater Feeder. This game is fun, like, genuinely really fun and actually kinda challenging. Premise of the game is extremely simple. You can probably glean most of what I'm about to say just by watching the footage of me playing it. You play as a hungry anteater, depicted in this Doom-esque HUD. Click on ants and other bugs to gain points. Each round has a required number of bugs that need to be caught in order to progress to the next round. The player can gain additional points by clicking on apples, bars of chocolate, and other food items. The player needs to be mindful of their energy meter. Any click, successful or not, will slowly deplete the meter. The meter regenerates by itself over time. If the meter runs out, the anteater will be stunned for a few seconds. Early levels are slow-paced enough that the player would have to go out of their way to deplete their meter, but in later levels, this meter creates an interesting risk-reward system. By clicking on optional food items, you gain more points but run the risk of letting your energy meter deplete when you need it the most. While all this is happening, the player also needs to watch out for various stage hazards like poisonous bugs, peppers, dung beetles, and more. There's a surprising 100 levels of this, and around 10 or so mystery levels the game loops through after you beat level 100. There's a surprising amount of fun to be had here. Sure, it isn't the most mechanically rich game in the world, but it doesn't need to be. This is a game still aimed towards children. And besides, I fail to see how this is any less dignified than something like, oh, I don't know, Subway Surfers or any one of those other generic mobile games. At least this game doesn't lock additional content behind a paywall. I know for a fact that when I was little, I spent most of my time on this minigame. I think the game's superb sound design and animations really make this a joy to play. The act of clicking on bugs is always satisfying thanks to the crunchy sound effects and expressive sprites. Anyway, that's about it for Let's Explore the Jungle with Buzzy. This game is incredibly easy since, outside of 2 admittedly pretty fun minigames, there's hardly any gameplay to speak of. There's no way to really fail at a game like this. Still, this managed to be a very difficult game for me to play. I've outgrown this game. That's always a sad moment. Coming back to your childhood home and realizing that it's no longer the same place you left behind. I know for a fact I'm not the only person that returns to these old games, so I'm likely not alone in how I feel about this game. I don't really enjoy it so much now, but I remember that I got a huge kick out of this game when I was young. The best I can hope to do now is reflect upon the fun I once had, and make this video to preserve this game in the collective memory of humanity. And now that we've had a good cry, let's get on to the next game. Freddi Fish 3: The Case of the Stolen Conch Shell was released for Macintosh and Windows in March of 1998, so finally a game younger than me. It is the 3rd entry in the Freddi Fish series, as the name would suggest. It's also the part of the video where the games start to get actually really good. Like, insanely good. In my opinion, Freddi Fish 3 kinda represents the best of both worlds between Putt-Putt and Let's Explore. I think among the very young audience, Putt-Putt favors the relatively extrinsically motivated, while Let's Explore favors the relatively intrinsically motivated. I find that Freddi Fish 3 appeals to both audiences, and goes a step further. It features a more complex story with better animations and voice acting than Putt-Putt, but also has a greater focus on exploration and optional interactions than Let's Explore. Let's Explore only gave us a teaser of the improvement to the art assets of Humongous Entertainment's games. This is Humongous Entertainment at the top of their game. I love how expressive the animation is, and it's also detailed too. Something I noticed in my most recent playthroughs is how well their mouths animate. Now, sure, this game is a little primitive looking nowadays, but this was really impressive for the time, and it impressed me a lot as a kid. That design philosophy behind Putt-Putt I mentioned, getting to control a cartoon with your mouse clicks, has become fully realized here. I think one of my favorite details are the animations of Freddi and her friend Luther swimming between screens. As is the case with the other games we covered, outside of some mini-games, there's not a whole lot of gameplay to speak of, at least in the conventional sense of the term. All you're really doing is clicking. So a great deal of effort seems to have been put into these animations so that the act of simply moving characters about the screen is exciting and satisfying. Look at this, for example. Freddi is going to grab this purple sea urchin. She doesn't slowly glide over to its position in the way that Putt-Putt would have simply moved across the screen. Instead, she's constantly jumping in and out of the water, making big, loud splashes in the process. Here's another one of my favorite examples. Upon leaving the scary Bullies Club, Freddi and Luther don't just meekly swim away, they frantically bolt out of there. These little moments in between bursts of gameplay are so important, and it's great to see that they've been given the proper amount of attention and care. Speaking of gameplay, Freddi Fish boasts much more complex puzzles than Putt-Putt. In the very beginning of the game, before the main objective has been delivered, the player is given this small puzzle. All they have to do is pull this plug. This serves the same purpose as Putt-Putt's opening sequence, teaching the player how to interact with the environment. This also establishes the greater focus on puzzles than in Putt-Putt as well. On this screen, the player could also potentially run into a purple sea urchin or golden pipe. I say potentially because the locations of these items are randomized. These golden pipes are pieces of the stolen conch shell and are the game's main collectible. I want to say there's about 7 or so locations the pipes can randomly be in, but I'm possibly forgetting one. The game chooses 3 of these at random upon each new playthrough. The golden pipes take a lot more effort to obtain than Putt-Putt's main collectibles. One of the golden pipes is potentially found in this clam's mouth. In order to get it, you need to find a wallet, return the wallet to its owner to be given an orange sea urchin, trade the orange sea urchin for a foreign language phrasebook, use the book to talk to a foreign tourist to get him to give you the shim jam jimmity jam clapper gapper, and use said device with the humorously long name to keep the clam's mouth from closing. It's easy to dismiss this as a fetch quest, a term that has some negative connotations behind it, but remember who this game is being made for. Getting lost in the world is kind of the point, and moving about the screen is meant to be its own sort of reward. Besides, the player won't be wandering around aimlessly. The player is constantly wandering into puzzles and other activities. I think the puzzles here are the perfect difficulty. Difficult enough that they do require kids to think a bit, but not so difficult that you couldn't reasonably expect a child to figure it out. There's also other activities the player can wander into. An organ that the player can feebly attempt to make music on, a fairly unremarkable minigame, a talent show of sorts, and of course, all of those little optional interactions that made Putt-Putt, and especially Let's Explore, so memorable. Freddi Fish is absolutely loaded with them, and I'm happy to report that the silliness of Let's Explore has been preserved here.
Don't go sneaking round the ocean floor, unless you wanna mess with me. Don't go swimming too close to my door, down in the deep blue sea.
I love this game for its sense of humor. I think this game can be genuinely pretty funny.
Merci. Thank you for your help with MONSTRO creation. The profit will be something to be desired.
So does that mean we get 15% of all international and domestic sales?
No.
The game never really elicited more than a chuckle out of me, although we, of course, have to remember who this game was made for. Also, that's not entirely true. I actually laughed pretty hard at this for how unexpected it was. And the ending is also pretty funny. All this talk of exploration would be meaningless if the world wasn't worth exploring. Thankfully, the world of this game is absolutely gorgeous and is a joy to get lost in. As I established earlier, I think people nowadays have sort of rediscovered their love for this retro aesthetic, so if you ask me, there's a lot for modern audiences to appreciate here. Now I'm quite fond of Putt-Putt Joins the Parade, but I've been beating around the pixelated bush as far as that game's world is concerned. Cartown is not a very interesting place. It's a town. For cars. It's a car town. Car town. Amazing. But the world of Freddi Fish features this massive underwater civilization. There's a bright, loud carnival, there's an absolutely gorgeous lagoon, this peaceful AF island shore, and I think my favorite location is this sunken plane that one of the golden pipes can actually sometimes be found in. The world of Freddi Fish 3 is one of my favorite worlds in games to explore, and I say that without an ounce of sarcasm. The use of color here is just amazing. Everything is super vibrant and saturated. The fetch-questy nature of this game means that players may get lost, so they wanted to make the world one that's worth getting lost in. In my opinion, they were successful. I know for a fact that when I first played these games again after a literal decade, I still remembered locations like the lagoon quite vividly despite having not seen them for so long. I think it speaks to just how strong the environmental art direction in this game really is. Once the player finds all 3 golden pipes, they are taken to the final stage gauntlet thing, which is separate from the rest of the game world. The very maze-like design serves as a good final test for the player. Now I find this place very easy to navigate, but I know it gave me lots of trouble as a kid. After this section is done, the player is randomly assigned one of the several endings for this game. The identity of the thief is one of the things that is actually randomized on each playthrough. All these things combined make Freddi Fish 3 a highly replayable game, and honestly, one that I find is genuinely fun to come back to today. In case I haven't made it obvious, I actually think quite highly of this game and Humongous Entertainment as a whole. I think more than any other game I've played, this game serves as a really nice little window into my past. Everything was just so much more interesting back then when I was more intrinsically motivated and naturally curious. All this stuff was so exciting, and to a certain extent it still is, just for different reasons. This video has been a very different endeavor to the kinds of videos I made 7 years ago. However, I will now feebly attempt to throw fans of those a bone. In those old videos, which were mostly reviews of the Crash Bandicoot games, I'd end the video on a recommendation. Do I think this game is worth the effort of tracking down and buying? What kind of players would get the most out of this game? I thought about making a recommendation here, but realized that it might not be a good idea. I'm pretty sure anyone that goes out of their way to watch long-winded game analysis videos on YouTube is past the age where these kinds of games would remain engaging. Still, I do think I would like to make a recommendation. If you have children, or happen to know anyone with children, these are definitely the kind of games that kids should be playing. The games are simple enough that children can understand them, but not so simple that it insults their intelligence. Since their initial releases on Macintosh and Windows, these games have been ported anywhere and everywhere you'd want to play them. Steam, GOG, the iOS App Store, Google Play, the Pirate Bay, anywhere you want. In fact, as I make this video, the games are actually on sale. Hopefully that sale hasn't ended by the time this video comes out. Even if they aren't on sale, they're only like $6 normally, which in my opinion is well worth the price. I mean, what would you rather have kids play? Garbage like Candy Crush? Candy Crush doesn't teach them anything except that ads exist and they can waste their parents' money if they try to skip them. In contrast, Putt-Putt Joins the Parade is a great first video game for kids. It's so insanely simple and intuitive that anybody can get through it, and there's a really nice charm to the old aesthetic of this game. However, because it's so old and so simple, older kids may get bored, or may reach the end game of seeing every optional interaction. Let's Explore the Jungle with Buzzy has much more content to offer, including a genuinely fun minigame that can put Candy Crush or any other freemium mobile game to shame. Sure, these games are a little simple, but I'm willing to bet that they'll still impress kids. They still impress me to a certain extent. Freddi Fish 3: The Case of the Stolen Conch Shell is a genuinely excellent game, and I find that when compared to the rest of the Humongous Entertainment collection, it holds up extremely well. Obviously, I would strongly recommend this one for children, and to be perfectly honest, if you're someone that's enthusiastic about games and game design and happens to stumble upon Freddi Fish 3 while it's on sale, try it out. It's not a challenging game, and it's not a long game, but the entire thing is an extremely charming experience. Plus, there's a lot of other things to appreciate here. We've seen pixel graphics make a comeback, we've seen people's affinity for the entire retro game aesthetic come back through all sorts of memes and discussion, and we've seen point-and-click adventure games make a comeback, for better or for worse. And as for Humongous Entertainment themselves, they've moved on. The founders of the company left, and the company was tossed around between larger companies until eventually it died and was reborn and landed in the lap of someone that had the bright idea to release the games on modern platforms. Keep in mind that if you buy the game nowadays, the Humongous Entertainment that you bought the game from are not the Humongous Entertainment that developed these games. As they exist now, they are a completely different company, a mere husk of their former self. Kinda like Naughty Dog. This isn't me suggesting you shouldn't buy the games, and that I'm not thankful for someone making these games more readily accessible to people. I just feel like we owe it to the honest, original creators of the game to acknowledge their efforts, not just the nameless rights holders. In my opinion, these were amazing games to grow up with. I'm extremely grateful to all the people that worked on these games. If anyone from that company happens to stumble upon this video, thank you. For, not filling these games with stupid liberal crap!